The Bentley's door closed with the soft, decisive click of a life that had almost never known unexpected noise. Harold Whitmore stood for a moment with his palm on the cool leather, listening to the city wake. A distant car alarm, the steady clack of a delivery cart, a gull's keening somewhere above the warehouses. He had driven down past the river, past the newer towers, where his name sometimes appeared beside philanthropic pledges, until the streets narrowed and the neon grew meaner. He had not meant to be stopped by anything so ugly as an alley. He saw her before he recognized her name, a woman curled in the shadow of a dumpster, wrapped in layers of whatever had been left to her, an army blanket, a thin cardigan, a floral scarf that had seen better seasons. Her hair, once carefully kept, was a loose tangle. Her cheek bore an unfamiliar paleness. Harold's breath hitched. The face, there in the wrong light, was the one that had folded his napkins at dinner parties, that had arranged the silver, that had worn an apron and hummed under her breath as she set lemon meringue pies on cooling racks. He had not expected to find Mavis Green here. She did not flinch when he called her name. She answered instead with a slowness that belonged to someone who had learned how little demand on her attention mattered. Her hand moved to the thin fabric near her collarbone and peeled it away for a moment. A pale, ragged pattern of scars shivered across the soft skin of her upper chest and collar. They were old and new. The skin around them had a cautious sheen. When Mavis met his eyes, the recognition was neither sudden nor dramatic. It was quiet, as if a chapter had simply folded. "You're Harold," she said. Her voice was thin, like a thread that had been pulled too tight across too many winters. Her fingers curled around a small, familiar object tucked beneath her shawl, and for a sliver of a second the world narrowed to the two of them and a single ring glinting in the grey morning. He thought of keys. He thought of a little brass one that had hung from a ribbon behind a framed photograph in his study, the one he'd given her on her 21st birthday. "Home," he had said then. She had laughed and baked him a lemon pie, and the house smelled like sugar and eggs. That smell came back now as a memory so fierce it hurt. "Where's the apartment I gave you, Mavis?" Harold asked. And the question was ridiculous in how simple it sounded, and how unfathomable the answer might be. Mavis looked away briefly. She rubbed the scarred place near her ribs with the pad of her thumb, a small private motion. "I don't know," she said. "It wasn't there when I needed it." Harold's chest tightened. The alley hummed with the city's indifference. A rat scuttled past a discarded takeout container. A streetlight buzzed. He could feel the weight of the question, literal and moral, settle on him. The billionaire who funded hospitals and campus wings and scholarships, and yet who in this moment could not reconstruct the life of the woman he had raised. What happened to her apartment? Why was she under a dumpster when she had a home once? He crouched because it was the only way to meet her at all. She smelled faintly of lemon rind and soap and something else he could not name. Old smoke, maybe, or the copper tang of fear settling into bones. Her hands were calloused where his memory refused to give her calluses. They were the hands that had washed fine china, not supposed to clutch onto trash. "You can't be here," Harold said. The sentence was a prayer and an accusation at once. "Tell me where you've been." Mavis blinked slowly, then let out a breath that shivered like the first brittle note of a song. She stopped. The alley made promises she did not need to keep. She drew her cardigan closer and showed no more than the faintest hint of the brass ring at her finger, the ring he'd once watched her try on, and then slip off because she felt it belonged to someone else. She had kept its memory, not the possession. There is a peculiar violence to someone who knows a person for decades, finding them where the world disposes of people. Harold felt it run along his skin as if he had been slapped. He thought of Margaret, his late wife, who had taken Mavis in the first time because a little girl with flour on her cheek had wandered into the Whitmore kitchen seeking a place to stand. Margaret had seen her like no one else. Margaret had baked with her, whispered old family recipes into her ear, tucked her into a bed the first night she stayed. The apartment had been Harold's attempt at doing something clean and definitive. A deed, paid taxes, the idea of a life that did not depend on waking up in someone else's kitchen. Now the life had splintered into trash bags, and a scarf, and a ring that had travelled with the woman who once belonged to their household. He felt unmoored, the way someone can feel when a pillar of their life is quietly hollow. Mavis shifted, and the movement was a small earthquake of memory for both of them. Harold extended the thermos he had not meant to bring out of the Bentley, tea, because he had once seen her prefer it. She accepted with a hand that trembled, took a sip, and closed her eyes as if taste could stitch a seam in time. When she opened them again, she was distant, a woman set apart by something that had come between her and every small, familiar thing. "How long?" Harold asked. "Long enough," she said. "Long enough to forget how many tiles we had in the kitchen. The line between rich and poor has a smell as well as a sight. It is the scent of soap in a bathroom you never clean yourself, the lemon tang of a crust cooling on a windowsill, the grease and metal of the city that take everything and do not ask." Harold stood in the Bentley, an absurd symbol of a life that had tried to fix everything, suddenly seemed out of place against spilled oil and flattened cardboard. He could have summoned aid, a driver, a social worker, a hospital van. Instead, he called Jerome Boone. He should have called the police. He would later understand why he chose differently, because his first instinct was not to make Mavis into an exhibit for the press, not to fold her suffering into public spectacle. He had a private investigator who used to be with the Bureau, practical, relentless, clear-eyed. Jerome would know how to gather things, proof, footage, a chain of custody that could survive courtroom scrutiny. Jerome would know how to be a ledger. "Don't talk to anyone you don't trust," Harold told Mavis, softer this time. "Not yet. Let Jerome get here. Let's—" He stopped because he did not want to be the one to promise safety when he had not yet provided it. Mavis gave him a small smile that did not reach her eyes. It was, historically, her shy concession to gratitude. "You always worry too much," she said. It might have been play when she was younger, rebellion in the face of his polite anxiety. But here it was a brittle remnant of better times. Harold felt the difference between being a benefactor and being a father, as if he'd been handed a ledger and then told the numbers were mine to erase. He decided in that precise moment that he would not walk away. The early light ate at the alley. A woman with a stroller moved past, a man with a cigarette, a courier with a stack of packages. Life continued in the city that was brutal and kind in equal measures. Harold had a plan that consisted of one stubborn word: home. If this scene has landed with you, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. It helps us know who this matters to. The story of how Mavis arrived at that dark place was not a sudden collapse. It was a slow erosion, like a countertop stained by years of lemons and steam until the surface goes soft beneath your hand. To understand what had happened, to understand the question, what happened to her apartment, one had to go back to a house that smelled of lemon meringue, to a woman named Margaret Whitmore, who had used words like anchor and family in a way that made them mean something solid. Margaret had been a quiet force. She made people feel as if they were the only thing in a room, an old-fashioned gift in a house full of Art Deco and glass. When she first found Mavis, a small, round-cheeked child in an overlarge coat who had wandered into their garden seeking shelter, she sat her down, tucked her into a chair by the place where the sun warmed the tiles, and handed her a wooden spoon. "Bake me a pie," she had said, and Mavis's face, dusted with flour, had lit up like the first electric bulb. There are few acts more formative than being taught how to make something for another person, and having that act be taken as your service and your art. Mavis learned how to beat egg whites until they held peaks, how to judge sugar by sound. She learned, perhaps more importantly, how to disappear into the service of a family and be noticed for it. Margaret did not merely praise her. She treated the work as a craft, insisting on small things. A towel folded in a particular way, the correct amount of lemon zest, a napkin ironed to the proper crease. Mavis listened, copied, and then made the gestures her own. On her 21st birthday, Harold had given her an envelope that made the world shift. In it was the deed to a small, sunlit studio on the other side of town. Paid in full, taxes covered, a key that fit a real lock. He had wrapped it in a bow and the photograph of Margaret with flower on her cheek. "I want you to have a place that is yours," he had said, in the clumsy way that rich men often say sincere things. Mavis cried, muttering about not deserving such a thing, then laughed and hugged them both. The lemon meringue pie, her pie, sat on the table between them like an altar. The apartment became a quiet testament to belonging. It had a sunlit room, where she kept mason jars of preserved lemons, where she draped a faded apron over a chair, like a kind of armor. She came to it after long days at the Whitmore house, locked the door, and felt for the first time unobserved. It was not a gift that was merely about property. It was a promise of independence, a line drawn between service and being. Then Lydia appeared. She did not arrive like a thunderclap. She arrived like a silk dress over a house of cards. Lydia Whitmore had a tailored smile, a tilt of the chin, and a habit of making people feel as if they were not the measure of things. She was younger, energetic, social, someone who could make a living room sparkle with her presence. To Harold, in that first dizzy season after Margaret's death, she seemed like a light he needed. To Mavis, she was the wedge that would change the shape of the house. At first, Lydia's presence nudged at minor things, the way the flowers were arranged, the music playing at dinner. She had girls, Candace and Olivia, who came with attitude and the polished cruelty of those who are accustomed to privilege. They took up the afternoon rooms with laughter and the sound of their steps. They occupied the mirror in the upstairs hall and left a sense of new proprietorship in their wake. Mavis began to notice the shifting tables. The set allocated to staff moved. A chair that once hugged her at holiday meals now held a guest with a crisp jacket. Invitations to events that once included her became private affairs. Small exclusions can hollow a person. Mavis watched parties through windows, adjusted linens in a house where she once set the pace of the day, and learned to make her presence less necessary at the table. Lydia had a way of speaking that made generosity sound like an exercise in benevolence rather than an extension of human dignity. "We'll help in any way we can," she told Mavis once, and the words landed as a final seal rather than relief. The erosion accelerated subtly and then ferociously. Where there was a stable boundary, Lydia and her daughters tested it relentlessly. Candace, the eldest, believed that property could be reassigned with a word. Olivia, younger and quieter, watched and learned. Together they began to flex the machinery of what they could influence: financial accounts, social networks, a quiet alliance with a notary who had once done favors for the family. Documents, papers that meant home or the end of it, began to change color as if they were inked in gall. It is difficult to describe the slow work of institutional erasure without making it sound melodramatic. The truth was bureaucratic and banal. A bank that, once given a persuasive signature and a forged ID, moved funds. An administrator at a small college who accepted a letter claiming scholarship violations without full verification. A county clerk who reversed a trust after being fed a story of mismanagement. Each act, on its own, was a small stroke of plausible deniability. Together they formed a wall. Mavis first noticed a hiccup when a letter arrived, stamped with an office that belonged to someone with authority. It was dry, confidential. Her scholarship, an offer she had received for community college classes, was gone. Then another letter, an overdue notice for property taxes that had always been paid. She called the Whitmore office. She was told things that did not fit, reassurances about oversight, vague apologies. She felt herself being funneled into an acquiescence she did not want. Maybe there's been a mistake, she told herself. She wrote letters and left messages. She demanded receipts. She learned to feel small when she had been taught to move like a woman who could command a kitchen full of imported sugar. There are ways to make someone disappear that do not require violence. You remove legal standing. You file a false custodial claim. You get a loan in the other person's name and then default, making them look careless. You lean on officials who prefer a neat story to a disputed, messy truth. Lydia and her daughters had learned these techniques at the edges of power. They were practiced at making a narrative that fit the shape of benefit. They told the world that Mavis was unreliable, someone who had mismanaged resources, someone whose memory of a deed was sentimental at best. The law moved like a glacier, slow, heavy, and indifferent. Harold, when he saw the first evidence, assumed clerical error. He signed a request to investigate, but never imagined the speed and depth with which their circle could be weaponized. His grief after Margaret's death blurred the map of where his responsibilities lay. Lydia was a balm he had not known he needed. Mavis was a constant, quiet presence he had trusted to be there. The splitting of loyalties in his house had been invisible to him until the stakes rose high enough to become visible. Then there was the envelope, ordinary, yellow, slid beneath Mavis's door like a bland suicide note. Inside it was a copy of a property transfer. The brass key he had given her was shown, in those pages, as a courtesy rather than ownership. The apartment's deed had been reassigned to a trust controlled by Lydia's extended family. A signature, forged with the precision of someone who had watched the way Mavis wrote her name, sat in neat black ink at the bottom. The paper felt like a betrayal folded into his hands. Mavis knocked on doors, went to offices, and faced staffers who squinted at her like she was an accessory from a past season. She asked for copies of the notary's registration. She met polite refusals and references to policies that made her pleas hollow. Where she had imagined the law as a place of rescue, she found it could be an instrument of finality. She started to learn to hide the ways fear settled into the bones. Then came the night she left. No one saw the moment she took her single shoe from beneath a bed in the studio and stepped into the corridor that smelled faintly of bleach and lemon. A security camera caught a figure with a bag crossing the street. Grainy, unsure, pausing at a lamppost as if listening for instructions. Later, when Jerome would blow up the frames and watch them as if they were parts of a confession, he would get a flash of the vehicle that eased up the curb. A dark SUV, the gloss of a commercial plate, the way the light hit a logo that was nearly, but not quite, familiar. Mavis remembered the apartment's door, hitting the frame behind her like a book slamming. She remembered the thin echo of her footsteps on the sidewalk, the weight of a small bag of clothes, the ring in her pocket grinding against the metal. She walked for hours, because walking keeps panic at a distance. Afterwards, when she tried to reconstruct that night, memory offered only shards. A man's boot in a frame of grainy footage, a yellow taxi's headlight, a scent that might have been smoke. What followed was something that did not require a bright hand. It required patience and cold planning. There was an abduction caught on a bus stop camera, not in the way movies show abductions, but in the way real life does. A hand on an elbow, a whispered insistence, the quiet compliance of someone who knows that resistance might mean more harm. The footage would show her being coaxed into an SUV. It would not show what happened after. Jerome later would watch that grainy sequence on his laptop and say many times that the world had given him enough to damn the people who had taken her, but not yet enough to free her by law. When she reappeared months later, in an alley like a wound reopened, she carried the sediment of those months in her skin. Scars were only one part of it. The other parts, nightmares, dissociation, the moments when a doorway flared and she could not breathe, were invisible. She wrapped herself in layers because layers could pretend to be armor. Harold, at the edge of that alley with a thermos in his hand, felt every one of those invisible moments like a personal failure. He had resources that could pry doors open. He had a name that could marshal attention. But between the use of his resources and the kind of help that truly heals was a gap that had been allowed to expand for years. That gap bore responsibility. Jerome arrived with the efficient silence of a man who had been trained to read the world like a ledger. He assessed Mavis with a professional's respect for physical evidence and a human's respect for what it is to be broken. He did not ask prying questions. He collected what he could, observations, an account of her current state, a photograph that Harold would later wish he had never taken, because some documentation feels like theft, even when it is necessary. "You're going to be okay," Jerome said to Mavis, with the quiet insistence of someone trying on hope as a practical tool. He had been in rooms where people were harmed in ways that made the clean lines of a report sound absurd. He had a folder with names and dates, and a pen that had seen confessions. He knew where to start. The hospital took Mavis with more reluctance than Harold expected. There was triage, there was antiseptic cold, and fluorescent light. There were forms that asked for next of kin. Harold watched a nurse wheel Mavis away and had the sudden animal panic of someone who had spent decades believing that the right bank account could solve everything. He learned quickly that money could open doors, but could not simply restore everything it had let slip. Dr. Reyes, Harold's physician, met him with the professional calm of someone whose career had taught her to be both blunt and gentle. She spoke of scarring, of infection, of the need to document injuries for both treatment and evidence. She said the word PTSD in a way that was clinical and did not flatten the human story that followed it. "Complex trauma," she said. "This will take time. She'll need steady care and consent at every step." Harold nodded, feeling the ground under him solidify into a plan he could not yet fully name. Mavis's medical intake asked for details she was reluctant to provide. Jerome insisted that she fill out the consent forms that mattered: release of certain records, permission to photograph injuries, a formal chain so that legal counsel could piece together what had been done to her. Mavis hesitated because consent is a currency she had learned to spend sparingly. The world had taken many things. She wanted the right to choose what to let go. On a grey afternoon, in a room that smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and the faint sterility of hospital laundry, Mavis sat with a cup of something that was more water than tea and unfolded a memory into a small, careful sentence. Harold listened. Jerome wrote. Dr. Reyes watched for signs of distress and had a handkerchief near at hand. Mavis told them about a hand holding her, about a woman's voice that instructed with economy, about a shadow of a name she had heard once in the background. She did not give them a full narrative because the mind saves some rooms for itself, but she gave enough to set a legal chain in motion. Outside the hospital room, Jerome began to pull threads. He had a way of moving through bureaucracies that was both patient and relentless. He requested surveillance footage from surrounding blocks, accessed traffic cams, called small businesses that had cameras pointing to alleys. He compiled a list of purchases, a probable route, a dark SUV sighted near an industrial loading dock. He kept his notes tight, his language exact. He knew the law required evidence that could stand under cross-examination, not just righteous anger. One of the frames he captured, grainy, washed in sodium vapor light, showed Mavis's silhouette stepping down from a curb, carrying a small bag. Another frame, a block away, showed the SUV with tinted windows pulling up too close. Jerome isolated the license number's blurriness and began the incremental work of matching it to a registered vehicle. He found a link that made him sit back in his office chair and look at the wood grain of his desk with a sudden impatience. A leasing company registered to a trust that bore a name close to the Whitmore circle. Harold, when Jerome called to tell him the initial fines, felt something like vindication and something like guilt at the same time. The vehicle had been seen near a storage facility that had, in a different paperwork set, ties to Lydia's extended family. Jerome's voice was precise. "We have an anchor to work on. It's not proof yet, but it's direction." They would later test that anchor with subpoenas and witness statements and the careful, sometimes crafty work of making the world legal. For now, Jerome's discovery was enough to offer movement. Mavis, during those first hospital days, lived in a world of fragments and small comforts. Dr. Chambers visited and asked about nightmares and grounding techniques. "Keep a string in your pocket," she suggested, and it became for Mavis a talisman. Baking became an exercise in medicine, the rhythm of whisking egg whites, the patient lift of a spoon from a bowl, the way a pie cooled so slowly you could measure time by it. She began to write letters that she did not send, accounts of small favors and small betrayals. She read and reread a recipe card that Margaret had written in a hand that slanted right and called it a map. Harold visited often and offered apologies in clumsy ways that sounded like attempts at restitution. He brought lemon pie once, which she accepted and ate slowly, savoring a memory that was no longer purely nostalgia, but a way to rebottle herself. He insisted, in certain moments that made him uncomfortable, that he had failed her. He said he had missed signs. He said he trusted the wrong people. Mavis listened, sometimes with patience, sometimes with the sharpness of a woman who knew what it meant to be praised and then left. Through it all, Mavis kept returning in quiet asides to the question of the apartment. What had happened to that small sunlit studio with the mason jars? Where had the deed gone? Jerome's early work had suggested one of the answers: forged transfers, corrupted paperwork, a trust that had been rewritten as if it were a garment to be retailored. But the trust, an instrument of law, was a legal entity that would take patience to unravel. The city, meanwhile, continued to hum with its indifferent industry. Newspapers would later ask who was to blame in a single headline. Harold would find the words for public apology inadequate. For now, in the hospital's fluorescent light, the work was quieter. Give Mavis pain relief, document injuries, ask for her permission to act. Jerome's folder began to bulge. He had bank statements, copies of deed transfers, a notation about a notary who had been unusually friendly with Lydia. He had, tucked into a manila envelope, the single shoe that had been found under Mavis's bed, clean, ordinary, an index to a life interrupted. Late one night, after the hospital's dim corridors had sorted themselves into sleeping and waking, Jerome sat at his desk with a USB drive in his hand. He had aggregated footage from block cameras, store cameras, traffic cams. He had a sequence that, when played in order, might weave the narrative law required. He inserted the drive into his laptop and watched the first grainy frames pool onto the screen. The pixels made nothing luxurious. Instead, they made a slow, undeniable truth. He paused the footage on a frame that showed a dark SUV pulling up at the curb with a logo that was practically unreadable, almost willfully vague, an emblem that, when he enhanced the image, resolved into a symbol used by a family trust associated with the Whitmore social orbit. Jerome's jaw tightened. He thought of protocol, of subpoenas, of chain of custody. He thought of Mavis in a hospital bed, choosing between paper forms and the slow unreeling of trust. Outside his office window, the city smiled in scattered lights. Inside, for a moment, time felt like a hinge. He pressed play. The footage moved like a legal argument in motion, every frame a sentence. The city exhaled, and the USB's small green light blinked steady, as if it were patient enough for a long fight. The frame softened. The alley light hummed. Harold sipped his tea in the chair by Mavis's bedside, watching Jerome's laptop with the helpless intensity of a man waiting to see whether the world he had shielded himself with could be dismantled and used to build something better. Mavis slept with a hand over her ring, small in the hollow of her ribcage, like a secret she kept from the night. Jerome's cursor hovered. He scrolled forward. The grainy image began to show a sequence of motion that would, when amplified and scrutinized by courts and counsel, pivot their lives. It began to tell of a presence in a dark SUV. It began to answer the question Harold had asked in the alley. The one about the apartment and how a woman could move from sunlit studio to sleeping beside trash. And then the footage dissolved into a frame of a face turned away, an uneasy promise that the next moments would force a reckoning of names and deeds, of who had used the machinery of a wealthy household as a tool of dispossession. Jerome sat very still, the room around him full of the hush that precedes action. The city held its breath too, as if for once it had to watch how its own people treated one another. The play button glowed. The screen waited. Jerome clicked play, and the laptop filled the room with a slow, humming motion of pixels. The footage was small and ordinary. Streetlights, a vendor cart, the tilt of a traffic cone, until, frame by frame, a narrative threaded itself through the noise. A dark SUV eased along a curb. A figure stepped from a shadow and guided another toward the open door with a hand at an elbow, insistent but not theatrical. The camera caught the glint of a ring when the sleeve pulled aside. The ring looked, even in low resolution, like something that belonged in a different life. Jerome froze the frame and blew up the image until it reddened at the edges. Enhancement revealed not a logo but a partial decal on the rear panel of the SUV, an almost insignia that matched a trust emblem found on a back document in an earlier file. He cross-referenced the make against leasing records and found, as he expected and dreaded in equal measure, a paper trail that never quite lost its way. The lease on the vehicle pointed to an LLC registered to a landholding trust with ties to Lydia Whitmore's extended network. A name kept appearing like a footnote through the ledger: Whitmore Family Trust, care of L. Whitmore and Associates. Harold sank back into the chair as if the weight of the recorded frames pressed into his bones. The laptop went dim, while Jerome rotated facts in his head, like stones in a palm. This was not yet a case in the courtroom. It was a spool of leads, a shaky vehicle trace, a notary with suspicious timing, bank withdrawals executed by a person who had access to the Whitmore account ledgers. But it was enough to aim an investigation. It was enough to begin unspooling the instrument that had turned a deed into paper and paper into erasure. They started with the paper. Jerome served subpoenas with the methodical calm of a man who knew when to be direct and when to be surgical. The bank produced stacks of transfers, each annotated with dates and initials. A wire from the Whitmore account to a shell company listed a purpose that was perfunctory at best: property consolidation. The notary's ledger, obtained under oath, bore a stamp that did not match the registrar's official book. Jerome found an entry for a signature made on a day when Mavis had an entry on hospital records for a routine checkup with Margaret. An impossibility. The pieces were small and boring. They were also damning. In the quieter corners of the investigation, Jerome looked for witnesses the police had never sought. He walked alleys, knocked on the doors of second-shift workers and convenience store clerks who remembered nothing, and then, after a cigarette and a question or two, remembered the man who rented a storage locker with a trust card, the woman who had a phone number matching a line on Candace's contact list. He found receipts for hotel rooms paid with a Whitmore trust card, and a bill from a clinic across town listing a medicinal purchase in Lydia's name. Harsh logic, when accumulated, began to outline culpability. Olivia, who had mostly stayed on the margins as a polished presence at charity galas, carried the first real tremor of change. For months, Harold and Jerome had hoped that one of Lydia's family would blink, to misremember or to confess. When she called Jerome from a borrowed payphone 2 weeks after Mavis's hospital intake, her voice trembled in a way that belonged to someone who had traded a line of defense for the ache of conscience. "I can't," she said at first, then steadied. She did not ask for protection. She asked for truth. She offered in tentative pieces what she had seen at the margins: a late-night meeting at a storage facility, a folder handed across a mahogany table, Candace's laughter in the dark. She did not admit to hands-on cruelty. She did not have to. She knew of plans and signatures, the way anonymity could be manufactured with a signature and a stamp. Olivia offered a name that had been in the background of the household's receipts, an accountant who had been over-eager to help rearrange holdings after Margaret's death. She told Jerome about conversations in which Lydia had spoken about rearranging assets and securing the family for our daughters. She came with a trembling sincerity and with the knowledge that telling the truth might mean losing everything else she had been handed. Jerome listened. He did not promise freedom. He promised a path that led to the truth. That promise, small and procedural, mattered to Olivia as if it were a rope thrown into dark water. Her cooperation became a hinge. With her testimony, Jerome obtained internal emails, a spreadsheet that tracked household transitions, and a series of notary signatures that led neatly to the forged transfer. Olivia's willingness to speak carried weight in the courthouse precincts where papers mattered as evidence. She sat with a lawyer and answered questions the way a child learned a new language, halting, then clearer. Her statements became a map of culpability that connected Lydia and Candace to a network of professional enablers. It did not justify their acts. It explained, with dull and corporate clarity, how they were done. When the district attorney brought charges, they were careful and precise. Fraud, forgery, and, for the most serious counts, conspiracy to remove someone's legal standing for pecuniary gain. The kidnapping and physical abuse investigation would be its own sequence of motions, separate, overlapping, requiring testimony that could not be engineered out of borrowed thumbnails of footage. Jerome kept pushing for an official inquiry into the assault claims, even as legal counsel prepared a criminal case for the financial dispossession. They had to be mindful. Overreach could give the defense room to attack the credibility of the facts. The arraignment felt surreal, a courthouse that smelled of lemon oil from polished doors, press vans idling on the curb, a scattering of voices that felt both like gossip and justice. Lydia arrived in a sheath of public composure. Her daughters followed, one stiff with bravado, the other pale and uncertain. Cameras flashed. Harold kept his face leveled, as if to say to the world, "I will not let spectacle dictate what happens." Mavis did not attend the arraignment. She preferred quiet for the early stages, and she did not want her presence to breed headlines. The defense moved as expected. They attacked the chain of custody on the vehicle trace, asked for deeper proof of coercion, and contended that the signatures were legitimate. The lawyer's voice was calm and practiced. Jerome, prepared for this, continued to unspool evidence. Bank ledgers cross-matched to calendar entries showing Lydia's meetings with the notary, surveillance frames that placed Lydia's car near storage facilities, and, most damning, a voicemail saved by a receptionist where a woman's voice, clipped and polite, requested expedited processing of a trust transfer to prevent estate complication. Olivia's testimony would come later, and when it did, she was a study in contradictions, made whole by an honest admission. On the stand, she looked smaller, without the shield of a party dress or a prepared speech. She spoke of nights when Lydia and Candace discussed cleaning the house of liabilities, and of the fear she felt when Candace suggested using greater mechanisms to secure their inheritance. She spoke of a storage locker receipt tossed into a trash can outside Lydia's sister's law firm. Her voice did not tremble when she described the ledger entries. It only softened when she said Mavis's name. "I know she was family," Olivia said simply. I saw what happened, and I did nothing to stop it." It was not a dramatic confession. It was the kind of human collapse that sometimes changes the scale of a case. Jurors do not always need melodrama. They need a credible arc from denial to recognition. Olivia offered that arc, and it complicated the defense's neat narrative of clerical error. When the assault evidence reached the prosecutor's team, they moved with equal care. Mavis had been accessible to them on her terms. She had consented to documentation of her injuries, had allowed photographs to be taken and stored under chain of custody, and had provided a statement in a controlled way that protected her privacy as much as it did the case. Dr. Reyes and Dr. Chambers provided clinical observations, scarring consistent with thermal injury, symptoms congruent with complex PTSD, episodes of dissociation noted in records. The medical evidence did not paint a single moment of torment frozen in time. It presented instead the long tale of harm, symptoms, scars, the narrative that matched the missing months. The defense tried to frame Mavis as unreliable. They probed for inconsistencies, as is their duty, and they emphasized the absence of a full camera trace of the assault itself. The prosecution, however, had more than a grainy tape. It had a network of corroborations: Olivia's testimony, the storage lease, bank wires aligned with the timeline of Mavis's disappearance, the notary's falsified signature revealed by handwriting experts. It had the testimony of neighbors who had spotted Lydia's vehicle at odd hours, and of a sanitation worker who remembered seeing a woman leaving a bundle near a dumpster weeks before Mavis's reappearance. The trial opened in a packed courtroom that smelled faintly of old wood and the coffee of late jurors. Public interest had risen like steam. Curiosity sharpened by a billionaire's name and an image of a woman asleep beside a dumpster. Harold sat in the second row, hands folded, flinching at the parts of testimony that pulled memory into raw places. He watched Mavis with a particular sort of grief. He watched a woman who had been familial labor, a trusted presence in his household, appear in public as a person who carried history on her skin. The cameras had been barred from recording at certain moments at Mavis's request. The court respected that. Where the press could get a shot of a legal proceeding, they did, but the judge issued instructions about victim dignity and limited public detail about some medical evidence. Mavis took the stand with a steadiness she had not expected to find in herself. She dressed in something practical, a blue cardigan, an apron nail-stitched into a corner of memory, and spoke in small sentences, the kind that allowed truth to expand inside them without collapsing. She told the court about learning to make lemon meringue with Margaret. She told the court about the day Harold handed her a key and about the apartment that kept jars of preserved lemons. These small human details did the work that facts alone could not. They anchored her in the jurors' imaginations as a person, not a case. She described, without graphic embellishment, the sequence of institutional erosion. Letters that withdrew scholarships, notices that arrived with bureaucratic politeness, a signature that suddenly made her ownership a courtesy. She spoke of the night she had packed a single shoe and left, of the grainy frames that showed her walking toward a waiting vehicle, and of the months that followed in pieces and shadows. When asked about the scars, she allowed that they were a map of something she rarely spoke of. "I don't like to dwell on the way skin remembers," she said, "but it remembers." The courtroom absorbed that line like light through glass. The defense in cross-examination pushed on details. They looked for contradictions. They highlighted times when Mavis's memory faltered. She admitted to not recalling every detail. She admitted to leaving certain nights blank. It was not weakness, it was honesty. The jury watched as a person who had survived tried to tell the truth without letting her trauma be spectacle. Olivia's testimony arrived like a counterweight. She sat and read from notes she had once prepared for events where she would speak on philanthropy. Instead, she read about meetings in which she had been present while Lydia discussed assets. Her voice broke when she said she had seen the notary on a particular evening, that she had tossed a storage receipt away not thinking it mattered, and that she had been frightened into silence. She offered a fulsome apology in the witness chair that had the quiet of a person who had realized the scale of her complicity. Candace, the eldest daughter, took the stand with a kind of brittle defiance. Her lawyer painted her as a bystander, a woman who had been guided by her mother's counsel and who had been told to sign paperwork that seemed mundane. Lydia held her composure with artful calm. She testified with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to public performance, denying malice and emphasizing family concerns, estate planning, and the temporary reallocation of assets that, she said, had been arranged to prevent external lawyers from taking advantage of the estate. It sounded, in some parts, like the kind of coldly rational explanation that people believe in when they have convinced themselves of their own virtue. Then, in closing, the jury deliberated. They considered wire transfers and handwriting samples, the notary's ledger, Olivia's confession, Dr. Reyes's medical accounts, Jerome's surveillance maps, and Mavis's steady testimony. They rolled the facts into a verdict that felt, to many in the gallery, like a long-delayed recognition. Guilty on counts of fraud and forgery, guilty on conspiracy to dispossess. The judge read the verdict with the bland cadence of obligation. There was no dramatic gavel slam. Jurors blinked like people who had been awake at last. Lydia's face, for a moment, showed a small, private collapse. Candace's eyes narrowed into a look of someone calculating consequences. Olivia buried her face in her hands and let a single sob undo some of the tightness in her chest. Sentencing came months later and felt in its formalism like a ledger finely balanced. Lydia received a prison sentence proportionate to the weight of her crimes and was ordered to pay restitution. Candace received a lighter sentence and probation. Olivia's cooperation earned her leniency and a facilitated path to restorative accountability. The court ordered the reversal of the forged transfers. The deed to the sunlit studio was declared voided and returned, in legal terms, to its rightful owner. A long, sealed will that had been contested rose to prominence in the transfer of Harold's late wife's estate, and with it came a line that named Mavis as a beneficiary of certain holdings. The law had, in the end, performed the work that words had once intended and had been perverted. But the court's decision did not erase the months of disappearance or the scars on Mavis's collar. It could not stitch back nights of fear. It did, however, restore name and legal right. And for Mavis, name and right mattered in ways that were quieter than anyone predicted. They meant the choice of what to do with the resources she now controlled. In the weeks after the verdict, Harold stood with Mavis on the porch of a small ranch he kept for solitude, a place where paint peeled at the edges and light came in through high windows. The property smelled of hay and lemon soap, and in the kitchen, Mavis set a pie to cool on the sill. Harold had prepared a statement for the press, as their lawyers advised, but Mavis asked him to hold a different conversation, one not to be released to the cameras. She wanted to talk about how the money could be used. "I don't want a parade," she told him. "I don't want my past sold like a story for other people to clap at. I want—" She paused, fingers on the pie crust, "to make a place where people like me can be seen before they become invisible." She said the words in a voice that did not ask for permission. They were not a plea for charity. They were, instead, a plan shaped by the small rituals that had kept her human. A kitchen, a key, baking, a circle where names were spoken and not stolen. Harold's chest tightened in the way it always did when he listened to someone he loved make an uncompromising moral decision about how to use wealth. He imagined a foundation, a wing of a hospital, a nameplate on a bench. She did not want any of those. She wanted homes. She wanted a center for restoration that focused on privacy and agency, a place that did not make survivors into spectacles. No cameras, no press releases without consent, simple admissions criteria, and modest, durable programming. They sketched a plan over pages of notes that smelled faintly of lemon. Juniper House, she decided, as if the name arrived fully formed, a shelter and workshop blended, a place where women could rebuild identities without the glare. She also insisted on a center within it for counseling, vocational training, legal aid. The Lila Green Center, named in a different sense. Lila, a name that meant refuge to her. Harold offered resources but refused to be the author of the shelter. Mavis would be the founder. She would run things by a board that included survivors and professionals, not a list of socialites seeking moral laundering. Building Juniper House was not instantaneous. It required leases, permits, staff hires, and a careful negotiation between privacy laws and social services. Mavis insisted on a code of confidentiality so strict that some fundraisers balked. She wanted a kitchen that smelled like lemon and yeast, a small library with well-worn cookbooks, and rooms painted in soft, warm colors, not the antiseptic white of institutions. She wanted resident-led councils. She wanted to hire survivors in leadership roles, not as tokens, but as people with authority to shape programs. Dr. Chambers, who had guided Mavis's therapy, became a program director for Juniper House's clinical wing. She developed a curriculum that blended trauma-informed care with practical skills. The residency program emphasized consent at every step, voluntary documentation of injury for legal use, empowerment in deciding the pace of therapy, and a focus on small rituals designed to restore a sense of bodily safety, guided breathing, touch techniques with consent, grounding exercises like crocheting or baking. The early days of Juniper House unfolded in small, imperfect victories. The first resident, Shanice, arrived with a suitcase and a guarded look. She learned to make lemon preserves in a class Mavis taught with slow patience. Bria, a former high school sophisticate who had been erased from a trust she never knew she had, organized the community pantry so that it worked on the basis of mutual aid rather than pity. Kiara, who had been a resident for a month, started a peer support circle that required no professional at the center of every session, just a rhythm where people listened. Juniper House's doors were small, 3 bedrooms on the first floor, a communal kitchen, and a back garden where a sapling, an actual juniper, was planted in the first week. The Lila Green Center, housed within, offered pro bono legal consultations and workshops on financial literacy, taught by an ordinary woman who had once reconciled a small tax return and now took pleasure in helping others understand ledgers. The first legal clinic was a simple affair. Coffee, forms, folding chairs, and a lawyer who handed out photocopies of documents and explained patients. Media interest circled like birds in the first months. Harold, at Mavis's insistence, declined interviews that would make her a centerpiece. They released instead a short statement about the center's mission and a link to resources. People wrote letters offering linens and used mixers. A small foundation gave a modest startup grant. Resources arrived not in the torrents that make stories fashionable, but in the drip of genuine community support. A retired baker who donated trays, a high school teacher who offered sewing classes, a janitorial crew that volunteered on Saturday mornings. Mavis watched the slow accumulation of care like a tide that could be trusted. Recovery at Juniper House was not linear. Mavis's scars required surgeries that were functional rather than cosmetic, and each procedure demanded consent and time. Dr. Chambers's therapy sessions were patient, demanding of honesty, and full of small rituals. The practice of naming a fear, letting it sit on a table like a folded napkin, and then deciding if it should be packed away or confronted. They worked with art therapists who encouraged residents to make things with their hands: quilts patched with old clothing, jars labeled with lemon peel patterns, a mural that featured a narrow alley opening into a warm room. Mavis taught, not always pie, but the act of measuring, of attending to a sequence, of taking a step and then the next. She taught how to make a crust without fear of breaking, how to tell a story without the need for a camera, how to sign a document while keeping the original in a locked place. She valued small competencies because they returned a sense of competence. A turning point came when a former resident who had arrived at Juniper House in terror and left months later with a job and a modest apartment, returned to lead a support group. She had been one of those who once existed without a name on a ledger. Later, she would be a mentor. She stood in the kitchen and told younger residents she had once thought she was merely surviving, and then realized she could teach. That admission, raw and ordinary, became a model for the center's approach. Survivors leading survivors, with institutional supports rather than institutional domination. Not every day was triumphant. Some afternoons were full of small relapses, sleepless nights, flashbacks, a resident who left and then returned with new wounds. There were legal fights too. Lydia's appeals dragged like low tide, and the stress of court dates could revive old fears. The staff learned to bracket court seasons with an extra measure of care, fewer outings, more check-ins, and a quiet protocol for dealing with press inquiries. Through it all, Mavis insisted on one policy above all: advocacy without spectacle. 2 years moved in a passage that felt both swift and measured. Juniper House expanded modestly after its second year, when a community-backed endowment made a second building possible. They named it the Lila Green Center to honor the idea of refuge, not to be mistaken for anyone's personal branding. The new wing offered counseling rooms and an archive where legal documents could be stored and accessed by residents. The library grew to include not only recipe books, but legal primers, novels, and histories that told stories of resilience. Juniper House did not become a panacea. It did, however, become a place where the small rituals of dignity were institutionalized. Keys returned in a small box with a note, meals shared at a long table where everyone contributed, and a weekly circle where residents shared one small thing they had done that week for themselves. These rituals, quiet as bread crusts, had the power to matter. The empty chair ritual became a cornerstone of Juniper House's healing ceremonies. Mavis introduced it in the house's first winter, when nights lengthened and memories settled like frost. Each month, residents would set out a chair in the garden ringed by low lights. They brought a symbolic object, an apron, a small brass key, a scrap of a letter, and placed it on the chair. They would speak the name of whatever had been taken and then, in a communal motion, fold a napkin and leave it beside the empty seat. The ritual was about acknowledging loss and leaving it in a place where the community could witness it without turning it into a show. One late spring, they organized a different ritual, a bench and plaque ceremony in the alley where Mavis had been found. They worked with a local community group that agreed to host a modest installation, a wooden bench, a small plaque that read simply, "For those who were not seen." The ceremony had no cameras. Instead, residents invited neighbors, the sanitation worker who had seen a woman once near the dumpster, a vendor whose stall had been visible from the alleyway, and a handful of journalists who had promised to respect the privacy of the attendees. Mavis did not speak to the press. She read instead a small note to the people gathered, and then sat at the bench while others came forward to leave a folded letter or a jar of preserved lemons. The act of visiting that bench, in the very place where erasure had once been so literal, felt like a reclamation that did not rely on headlines. The legalities did not evaporate. Restitution came in parts, and the notary's confession, secured by Olivia's testimony and a few incriminating emails, led to a small but meaningful compensation fund for those who had been similarly marginalized by forged documents. The court's order to correct titles enabled Juniper House to allocate a portion of recovered assets into a trust that would fund programs in perpetuity. That trust became the Juniper Fund, administered by a board that included survivors, lawyers who specialized in victim representation, and local community leaders. The fund financed legal clinics, paid stipends for resident mentors, and supported scholarship programs that enabled women at Juniper House to return to school. The community dimensions of the center grew organically. Local bakers volunteered mornings to teach dough making. A retired teacher offered adult education classes. A small clothing co-op established a program for free professional attire for residents starting jobs. The Lila Green Center partnered with a neighborhood law clinic and a public mental health unit to provide coordinated care. Juniper House's model, small, consent-first, survivor-led, started to be studied by neighboring organizations who wanted to replicate the structure without reproducing the spotlight. Mavis remained cautious about public attention. She refused a book deal and turned down a major magazine profile. When the terms demanded intimate disclosures, she was not willing to commodify. She accepted, however, invitations to speak at small, survivor-centered conferences, where she spoke in a voice that trembled sometimes and was steady at others. She spoke about the deceptiveness of paper and the fragility of legal standing. She warned about the subtle ways power could be rearranged to displace those without recourse. She also shared recipes, because baking, she said simply, was a language many people could learn. In the center's second year, a young girl named Lila arrived with a mother who had left a life of quiet exploitation and wanted only to start again. Mavis met the child and thought, with a peculiar tenderness, of how Levy had once given her a key and how a small deed could become a promise. She named a scholarship within the Lila Green Center for support in Lila's honor. The girl learned quickly how to fold napkins and later how to measure flour so precisely it sounded like a ritual. Mavis began to talk more and more in the presence of children whose presence made long-term thinking sensible. There were moments of levity that made the place feel like a family rather than an institution. A resident started a garden where they grew lemon trees in large pots. Someone donated mismatched teacups, and the cupboard full of them became an exhibit of resilience. Each chipped cup had a history. They held parties on slow afternoons with bread and music. People who had been invisible learned to sit in the sun and be seen. Harold, for his part, learned that restitution was not a single check or a public statement. It was a long, humbling apprenticeship in listening and restraint. He served on a board for a short period, but stepped back at Mavis's insistence. His role was to open doors, which he respected enough not to hold open with a hand that pushed others aside. He visited Juniper House and sometimes sat at the long table, awkwardly but earnestly learning the names of those present. He learned the weight of apologies delivered without expectation of forgiveness, and he learned to let Mavis lead in ways that at first humbled him. Mavis's recovery was measured in small, domestic victories. She learned to sleep through an entire night without waking to the feeling of being watched. She allowed Dr. Chambers to help her work through dissociation with exercises that started with naming colors in a room and moved to reciting recipes in full. She consented to reconstructive procedures purely for function, releasing scar tissue that limited the movement of her shoulder, for instance, and not for cosmetic conformity. She returned to her studio apartment, now restored in title and in physical reality, and kept one corner dedicated to a small altar for Margaret, a flowery photograph, a folded apron, a tin of lemon peel. She did not let the apartment become a shrine. It was instead a room that could house life. At Juniper House's third annual gathering, now a modest festival for community supporters and residents, Mavis stood before a low stage and spoke in a voice that had learned the economy of truth. She told a crowd of people, some survivors, some donors, some curious neighbors, that the work of recovery was ordinary and patient, and that the house was named for a tree because a tree holds seasons and is not surprised by them. "We make pies," she said, and people laughed in a way that felt like a small easing. "We teach people how to make pies, but we also teach them how to keep receipts, how to bargain for a lease, how to find a lawyer who will not speak over them. We try to do both. We try to teach dignity in both the kitchen and the courtroom." A woman in the audience raised her hand and asked how to replicate the model. Mavis's answer was simple and firm. Listen to the survivors, prioritize privacy, fund slowly, and trust the mundane. The alley where she had been found changed too. The bench became a place where people left notes. A florist who ran a stall nearby brought a small bowl of lemons during the winter and left them at the bench. Teenagers found the bench and, on their way to school, sat with backpacks and voices unguarded. A sanitation worker who had once spotted a woman in the shadow came to the bench on its anniversary and sat for a while, eating a pastry someone had left. The plaque, "For those who were not seen," did its quiet work. There were moments when Mavis allowed herself private acknowledgements of loss. She would sometimes take out the brass key Harold had given her and hold it like a relic. The ring, once a talisman, she kept in a small box. When she opened it, it glinted against a small scrap of paper on which Margaret had written a line. "Home is less about walls than it is about the hands that know your name." Mavis kept that paper folded and read it when she felt unmoored. On a certain rainy afternoon, 2 years after the alley discovery, Juniper House held a small celebration. It was not a headline-making gala. It was a potluck. People brought soups and breads. The children performed a clumsy play about a lemon tree that refused to stop giving fruit. Mavis, who had learned to be cautious with joy, watched and let herself be present. After the meal they walked, as they often did, to the bench in the alley. The city had added a trash reduction program in that block. Life had changed in a way that was small and civic. They placed a new plaque at the bench's base, a second plate that detailed the founding of Juniper House and listed a small phone number for assistance. Mavis sat on the bench and let the rain make small dots on her cardigan. She did not feel triumphant. She felt quiet, like someone who had rearranged furniture in a house and then discovered that the light came in differently. A little girl, not more than 6, ran up and took Mavis's hand. She had the vigor and lack of caution of a child who has not yet learned to measure her value against commerce. Mavis visited the archive later that evening and found in a drawer a letter from a woman who had once left Juniper House and found steady work. The letter read, "You gave me a measure of things I did not know I needed. Thank you." She read the lines twice and then folded the letter into a small envelope. The final scene that closed this chapter was quiet and domestic. A winter evening settled soft and early. Juniper House's kitchen smelled of lemon and yeast, and a small radio played an old song in the background. Mavis sat in an armchair with a child on her lap, a child who had been a resident at the house and who now attended the local school, healed enough to sleep through the night. Mavis opened a book, a story about a small lemon tree, and read aloud in a voice that sometimes caught at the edges. The child listened with the concentrated attention that makes the world feel whole again. Around them, in the softer light, other residents moved like slow music, someone setting cups on a table, another tying a ribbon, a pair of hands folding laundry. There was no final speech, no manic proclamation of victory. The house was full of ordinary noise, a kettle hiss, a cutlery ring, low conversation. The ring that Mavis had kept rested in a small box on the side table beside her. and once in a while her fingers brushed it, as if remembering a handshake from the past. Harold, at a distance, and with a kind of respectful distance Mavis now required, watched from the kitchen doorway and smiled with something akin to a release. He had entered this story as a man who believed resources alone could repair harm. He was leaving it with an understanding that repair required time, humility, and the insistence of those who had been harmed to define the terms of their recovery. The bench in the alley, the plaque, the small sapling that had begun to grow by the garden, these were not tidy endings. They were markers of work still to be done. Juniper House would keep its doors open not because it had solved the world's inequities, but because, in its imperfect way, it offered a place for people to be seen and to rebuild the small competencies of life. On a narrow shelf in the kitchen, beneath a framed photograph of Margaret with flour on her cheek, sat a small wooden box. Mavis opened it and took out the brass key Harold had given her. She turned it in her fingers and then, with a deliberate tenderness, passed it to the little girl on her lap. "Keep it," she said, "but not forever. Keys are for moments." The child's eyes widened with the gravity of receiving something both literal and symbolic. She clutched the key as if it were a toy, and yet, perhaps, as if she already understood it as a token of trust. Juniper House would not be a place of single answers. It would be a place of continuities. It would be a place where people baked pies and learned to keep a ledger, where scars were acknowledged and not displayed, where restitution could fund programs but never be mistaken for absolution, where survivors could become mentors, where the banalities of daily care became the scaffolding of dignity. The alley would always carry its memory. Harold would sometimes walk past the bench and touch the new plaque, as if to remind himself that his life had been altered by a discovery that cut through his complacency. Jerome continued his work, taking new cases, always with an eye for the small evidentiary threads other people missed. Olivia, who had offered the first tremor of conscience, enrolled in a restorative justice program and applied her energy to helping repair the structures she had once helped dismantle. Mavis, when she allowed herself to reflect, thought of lemon meringue pies and the way Margaret had taught her to measure both sugar and kindness. She thought of the apartment that had once been a promise, and of how promises could be kept again, and differently. She thought of the ring, the key, and the bench. She thought of the empty chair ritual she had introduced. She thought of how small acts of repair could gather into a life. The last lines of her private journal, kept in a locked drawer she sometimes forgot she had, were spare and not a claim to moral vindication. They read, "We do not cure everything. We hold hands, we teach, and we listen. We plant a tree." If this story moved you and you want to help survivors find safety and dignity, learn more about how to support organizations like Juniper House. Link in the description.